This past Labor Day weekend, I was a panelist on three privacy related panels hosted by Electronic Frontiers Forums in Atlanta, Georgia. Those panels were recorded, and I was granted permission by Electronic Frontier Forums to create and share these shortened versions of those videos. I have placed a link to the full 1 hour long discussion in the description of this video. I am Dr. John Padfield. I'm a business professor and a former Indiana State Representative, and this is Business Reform, where we discuss issues at the intersection of business, technology, and society. This panel discussion was entitled Surveillance Tech, Propaganda in Fiction.
Thank you all so much. I'm Leah Holland, they, she. I'm Campaigns and Comms Director at Fight for the Future. And I just learned that John has actually prepared a little bit of a history of propaganda and how it has changed over the years for us. And I think that's a really great place to start. So John, please take us away with a little rundown.
I have to admit, the first time I ever heard the word propaganda was looking at the panels that were going to be offered today. But as soon as I read the word, I immediately knew what it was talking about because I have seen it over and over again. And I did not realize just how far back propaganda goes. When I started doing a little bit of reading about the history of police propaganda in mainstream media, it goes all the way back to Andy Griffith. It was subtle, but over time it's become a little less subtle. Not going to go into a ton of detail here just for the sake of time, but 1967, the LAPD created the first SWAT team. And it was largely in response to campus protests, civil unrest. They decided we need a special weapons and tactics team to deal with large events. That was 1967. 1970s, there were some things going on. A few other communities decided to do SWAT teams. 1975 is a key year. That's when Hollywood came out with the TV show SWAT. Robert Ulrich, Steve Forrester, and a few others. But they are the ones that made SWAT teams. How on earth can your small town of 40,000 people exist without a SWAT team? Everyone has to have one because every week, massive gangs of armed bikers are terrorizing towns. And the weeks that they're not doing that, drug cartels are coming in and terrorizing towns. And this led into the 80s and 90s. 80s and 90s, a lot of the propaganda was really focused on the war on drugs. And that's when we were seeing shows like Miami Vice, several others, movies, Carlito's Way and Scarface. And then 9/11 happened. And by this point, police forces around the country have pretty much been militarized throughout the 80s and 90s because we have to have machine guns and armored vehicles and helicopters and rocket launchers and everything else to protect us from the bikers and the drug cartels. 9/11 hits and the propaganda starts shifting. It's no longer about the weaponry. Now it's about the intelligence. How are we going to stop that next terrorist attack? And over, you're seeing stories of, well, this 12-year-old girl was abducted, but thankfully there was an ATM machine across the street. We were able to get some video off of it. And so these things start working their way into fiction. And yes, ATM footage is real. It has been used. But what happens is we see it on TV on a regular basis, and we start to assume it's much more common than what it really is. Purdue University, a doctoral student a few years ago, did a study. The survey asked people about how much do they watch of forensics TV shows, CSI, NCSI, some of the other shows that really focus on forensic technology. They ask questions about how much do you watch, and then they ask questions about what percent of murder cases do you think involve DNA? What percent of murder cases do you think involve these different technologies? There was an incredibly strong correlation. The more people watch these shows, the more they expect, if I'm ever called as a juror, I'm going to see all this evidence because that's normal. That's what I see on TV every night. So I'll leave it there. I just want to sum up saying propaganda has been around for a long time, but the agenda changes over time. And right now, surveillance seems to be the dominant theme.
I'm curious for the people that work with privacy or with surveillance, if you could share with us a little bit more, or maybe what is your creepy surveillance tech story?
I don't have a personal horror story, but I'll share with you. On my YouTube channel, I just made a recent video about Amazon purchased iRobot, and so now Roomba is owned by Amazon. And think about that when you have this little floor-mounted camera running around your house, mapping your house, and all that data is going to Amazon. MIT Review had a story about a woman in Venezuela whose photo appeared on Facebook of her sitting on the toilet because her Roomba went into the bathroom while she was in the bathroom. And the title of the article was Venezuelan Woman on Toilet Appears on Facebook. How did this happen? I don't think the robot did it itself. But obviously, number one, it has the ability to take your picture. And number two, somebody had access to that. So that's something for anyone that has a robot to think about.
That's one illustration of the import of narrative and a fiction that the police are creating with a surveillance technology. But I'd be really interested to hear some other examples of how fiction impacts policy.
When we have these discussions around surveillance, we're starting to get into the area where people are thinking about things like Minority Report, pre-crime. Like, we have a vocabulary to talk about pre-crime. We don't want people to be jailed based on an assumption that they might commit a crime in the future. It's great. We can articulate that now. But the problem is we're kind of sort of already doing that with things like sentencing algorithms that compute, like, so famously, if you're a turbo nerd like me or folks I work with, so sentencing algorithms are this thing that got really hot, I would say probably like maybe they started about a decade ago. And this question, basically the pitch to courts was, hey, you guys are really bad at guessing whether or not someone's going to reoffend after they've been in jail. And so use our super magic black box software, and it will tell you how long, like what their chance of recidivism is, and they will spit out a recommended sentence for you. The federal sentencing guidelines get really wacky. State level, it's even wackier. And so judges are like, oh, thank God, something that can make the decision for me. And once you actually crack some of these things open, at least one of the more popular ones, I think in use in Chicago, was found to basically use their chance of recidivism was essentially just based on the zip code that the person lived in, which is super correlated to your race. So it would spit out things like, oh, if you live in Kenwood, which is a neighborhood that's outside of Chicago, then you're more likely to, reoffend. Also, incidentally, they're probably poor and black. And so there's this huge systemic problems that come with this. And right now, trying to explain to folks who are trying to sort of bridge the snake oil gap of, sci-fi on one hand has taught us to think that computers are all powerful, which can be a real problem when you're trying to say like, no, actually, they're really flawed and they're using these really, really, something like an 80% false positive rate for something like ShotSpotter, and trying to articulate that when the sales pitch coming from folks is, oh no, this is a magic computer box that will solve all of your problems for you, is like a truly embarrassing amount of the fight in tech policy a lot of the time.
I want to build on what you just said about computers. My PhD is technology, leadership, and innovation. I have done consulting work for law enforcement before. When you mentioned that we are in the most surveilled city in the United States, here is my very first question. Are we in the safest city in the United States? I'm seeing some head shaking. No, why? I'm confused. How can this not be the safest city in the country if it's the most surveilled city in the country? Let me give you the answer real quick. Technology is never good or bad. Technology is neutral. It's what the person who controls the technology does with it. So that's the first thing that I always teach my students. Technology is never inherently good or bad. Second thing is technology is an accelerant. You think about if there is a small fire burning and you throw a can of gas on it, what's going to happen? It's going to burn faster because you threw an accelerant on it.
And when it comes to surveillance, AI is the giant tanker of gas we're throwing on surveillance right now.
Absolutely. And here's the thing that I have never shared this in public before. The entity that I was working with, it was a sheriff's department. The sheriff's department arrested somebody in a traffic stop from Georgia. This was not in Georgia, but the person they arrested at a traffic stop was from Georgia. And when they took the person into custody and ran their ID, there was a warrant from Georgia for this person for murder. And so the sheriff's department did what you do according to policy. You call the Georgia State Police and say, we have so-and-so in custody. Yeah. When are you going to come get him? We're not. He did not break anything other than a traffic law in the state that he was arrested in. That state cannot prosecute him for murder. They don't have the evidence. But when Georgia was notified, we have somebody that you have a warrant out for murder, they refused to come get him. Not our problem. Why would we want to spend resources to go to another state to pick somebody up and bring them back to hold them on trial? Now you take a system that broken and let's throw billions of dollars in security cameras on it so we can catch more people. Stop. How about we fix the broken system before we speed it up? And this absolutely drives me nuts. How many people do we know broke the law because there are eyewitnesses and we don't have time to deal with that? We got to go install some new cameras. Why? Fix the problem you have in front of you before you go try and fix something else.
So
Exactly.
the audience comment was, there's no money there.
I would love to hear, before we open up to audience questions, if folks have a recommendation for their favorite anti-propaganda piece of fiction.
I got two.
Go for it.
I highly recommend a movie that came out about 20 years ago called The Lives of Others. It's a period piece set back in East Germany before the wall fell, but The Lives of Others is a phenomenal movie. It is a work of fiction, but it is very plausible fiction because it depicts what the Cold War was like from a surveillance standpoint. The other work of fiction I highly recommend is a book by Brad Thor called Blacklist. This book came out 16 days before Edward Snowden went public with his revelations about the NSA. And the story of the book in a sentence: a couple of people in U.S. intelligence agencies use their vast troves of personal data to blackmail a couple of key members of Congress to kill privacy legislation and to increase the three-letter agency budgets. Now, I'm thankful that's a work of fiction and that could never happen in real life. But as a fiction book, that is a fantastic fiction book.
Isn't that the inspiration for Enemy of the State movie?
I'm not sure which one came out first, because Enemy of the State came out real close to that timing, but I can't remember which came first.
Enemy of the State would be my recommendation. It's kind of an older movie, but it is one that I watched as a young, very young adult with my friend that I talked about earlier. And I think it is the reason why he is so private to this day. Because when we walked out of the movie, he was like visibly freaked. Like we had seen horror movies together. I'd never seen him that scared after a movie.